That sound. You never forget it. For 12 years, it was the sound of my world ending over and over, the sound of cages locking. But this was different. This was the sound of the gate closing, behind me. They give you your old clothes, a bus ticket, and $73. They call it gate money. Enough for a meal and a hope. They don't tell you that the world outside has become a different planet, that the air itself feels hostile. I stood there, on that cracked sidewalk, a plastic bag holding everything I owned in my hand, and I have never felt more alone in my entire life. Inside, I was a number, a problem to be managed. Out here, I was a ghost, a man-shaped void that nobody wanted to see. The sky was too big. The sounds of a city going about its day, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic, a dog barking. It was all an assault. My skin felt like it was on backwards. Every cell in my body was screaming to turn around, to bang on that metal door and beg them to let me back in. At least in there, I knew the rules. I knew what the walls felt like. Out here, there were no walls, and that was the most terrifying prison of all. I started walking. I didn't know where I was going. The bus stop was a mile away, and with every step, I felt 1,000 eyes on me, even though the street was empty. I was a contaminant. I was the past that everyone wants to forget. The weight of my record, of my mistake, was a physical chain around my neck, heavier than any shackles they ever put on me. I was free according to the state, but I have never been less free. The real walls were just beginning to build themselves around me, brick by brick, made of shame and fear and the absolute certainty that I had nowhere to go. And that's the truth they don't tell you about freedom. It's not a gift they hand you at the gate. It's a void, a terrifying, silent emptiness that you have to find a way to fill. And standing there, with that $73 burning a hole in my pocket, I had nothing. No tools, no hope, no reason to believe that the next day would be any different. If this story is touching you, if you can feel even a fraction of this loneliness, then you're already sharing this burden with me. And that means more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let me know I'm not just shouting into the void. Let me know that out there, beyond these four walls I'm still trying to break, there's a connection to be made. The walk to the bus stop was a mile, but it felt like a march through a desert. Every car that passed was a judgment, every face in a window, a jury. I was a ghost walking through a world that had moved on without me. The plastic bag in my hand felt like it held the entire weight of my past, swinging with a rhythm that mocked my freedom. I reached the bus stop, a rusted shelter with a bench worn smooth by time. I sat down, the plastic groaning under my weight. This was it. The first decision of the rest of my life. Which bus to take? I unfolded the crumpled bus schedule, the lines and numbers a confusing blur. My mind, conditioned by years of being told where to be and when, was frozen by this simple choice. I felt a panic rising in my chest, cold and sharp. This was a test, and I was already failing. A bus pulled up with a hiss, its doors folding open like an invitation. The driver looked at me, his face a mask of bored impatience. I stared at him, my feet rooted to the ground. I couldn't move. I couldn't form the words to ask where it was going. His expression shifted from boredom to mild annoyance. "You getting in or what?" he grumbled. The spell broke. I shook my head, a quick, jerky motion. The doors snapped shut, and the bus pulled away, leaving me in a cloud of exhaust. I had failed. I couldn't even get on a bus. I spent the next 2 hours watching buses come and go. People got on, people got off. They had places to be, lives to live. I was just a piece of debris stuck on the shore. The $73 in my pocket felt like stolen money. What right did I have to buy a meal? To find a room? I was an imposter in this world of normalcy. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in colors I hadn't seen in over a decade. The beauty of it was a physical ache. It was a world that was not meant for me. The temperature dropped, and the thin jacket I wore was no match for the chill. I was alone, shivering on a bench, with a future that stretched out in front of me, empty and dark. The silence was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was in that silence that the past decided to pay me a visit. It didn't come as a memory, but as a feeling. A deep, cellular memory of the worst day of my life. The day I made the choice that led me to that bus stop. The day I became a ghost. The memory didn't come back as a story. It came back as a feeling. A cold, sharp knot in my stomach. The kind of fear that makes your hands shake and your mouth go dry. It was the feeling of standing in a convenience store, the flickering fluorescent light humming overhead. The feeling of a cheap, heavy pistol in my hand. A weight I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't a violent man. I was a desperate one. My sister was sick. The medical bills were a tidal wave drowning our family. I was working 2 jobs, and it wasn't enough. It was never enough. That night I got the call. The bank was foreclosing on my parents' house. It was the final straw. I saw no way out. The gun was a stupid, reckless idea I got from an even more reckless acquaintance. I thought I could get a few $1,000s, just enough to stop the bleeding for a month. I didn't even put on a mask. I just walked in, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pointed the gun at the cashier, a kid who couldn't have been older than 19. His name tag said Ben. His eyes went wide with a terror I now recognize in myself. "Empty the register," I said, my voice a strangled croak. My hands were shaking so badly I was afraid I'd drop the gun. He fumbled with the buttons, his movements slow and clumsy with fear. That's when the bell on the door chimed. Another customer, an older woman with a grocery cart. She took one look at me, at the gun, and she screamed. The sound was like a shard of glass in my brain. It shattered whatever desperate, single-minded focus I had. I panicked. I turned and ran, leaving the money, leaving everything. I ran for 3 blocks before I collapsed in a dark alley, vomiting from the sheer terror and shame of what I had done. I never even got $1. But I had gotten a life sentence. They caught me 2 days later. The prosecutor called me a menace to society. The judge agreed. My public defender told me to take the plea deal. 12 years. For a failed robbery where no one was physically hurt. But I had hurt everyone. I had destroyed my family's name. My sister passed away while I was inside. I wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. That was the real sentence. That was the pain that lived inside the prison of my bones. I wasn't just an ex-con. I was a failed son, a failed brother, a ghost. The world after the gate was a different kind of sentence. It was a life of invisible walls and closed doors. That bus stop was just the beginning. I eventually got on a bus, any bus, and found my way to a homeless shelter in a part of the city that time had forgotten. The shelter was a converted warehouse, a cavernous space filled with the sounds of coughing, muttering, and the relentless smell of bleach and despair. It was louder than any prison block, and in its own way, more dangerous. Here, there were no guards to keep order, just a fragile, unspoken code that could shatter in an instant. I tried to do everything right. I got a stack of applications from a local copy shop. Under previous employment, I wrote N.A. Under reason for leaving, I left a blank that screamed my guilt louder than any words could. I went to interviews, my hands clammy, my shirt stained with nervous sweat. The moment I had to explain the 12-year gap, It was over. I saw the shift in their eyes. The warmth would drain away, replaced by a cold, professional politeness. "We'll be in touch," they'd say, a phrase that became the mantra of my rejection. They never were. I was a ghost in the machine of society, an error code no one wanted to fix. The little gate money I had was gone within a week, spent on cheap food and a pair of decent shoes that were stolen from me my second night at the shelter. I was back to square one, but now with a deeper, more profound understanding of my own invisibility. The world doesn't hate you when you're an ex-con. It simply doesn't see you. You are a problem to be ignored, a statistic to be managed. The stigma was a scent I couldn't wash off, and everyone could smell it. The lowest point came on a Thursday. It had been raining for 2 days straight, a cold, relentless drizzle that seeped into your bones. I'd been in a line for a day labor job, but there were too many men and not enough spots. I was turned away. When I returned to the shelter, soaked and shivering, I found my cot had been given to someone else. My plastic bag of belongings was gone. The man at the door just shrugged. "No reservations," he said. It was the final straw. The last thread of my composure snapped. I had nothing. No dry clothes, no food, no hope. I was just a body, cold and empty, standing in the rain. I started walking with no destination, the city lights blurring into meaningless streaks of color through my tears. I was truly, utterly alone. The prison gate had released a corpse. I just hadn't stopped breathing yet. I found myself at another bus stop, this one darker, more isolated. I sat on the wet bench, the cold metal seeping through my trousers, and I gave up. This was where it would end. This was the freedom I had earned. The rain was a freezing curtain, soaking me to the bone. I sat on that bench, shivering so hard I thought my teeth would break. The cold was inside me, in the empty spaces where my hope and my future used to be. I was a hollow man. I had nothing left to give, no more strength to fight the tide of a world that had no place for me. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to surrender. This was it, the grand finale of my second chance. To die, cold, and forgotten, at a bus stop in the rain. I don't know how long I sat there. Time had lost all meaning, but then a shift in the air. The sound of the rain changed. It was no longer drumming directly on my head. I cracked open my eyes. There was an umbrella held over me. A simple, black umbrella. My gaze traveled down the handle to the hand holding it. An old hand, weathered and speckled with age, but steady. And then I saw him. An old man, maybe in his 70s, with a quiet face and eyes that held a deep, unsettling calm. He wasn't looking at me with pity or fear or disgust. He was just looking, as if I were a natural part of the landscape. He didn't say a word. He simply sat down on the bench beside me, close enough to share the umbrella's shelter, but not so close as to be intrusive. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was vast and deep, like a lake. He reached into a small, worn satchel he carried and pulled out a thermos. He unscrewed the cap, which became a cup, and poured a stream of steaming, dark liquid. The smell of rich, black coffee cut through the smell of wet pavement and despair. He held the cup out to me. My first instinct was suspicion. Nothing in my world was given freely. Everything had a price. But my hands, acting on a primal need for warmth, reached out and took the cup. The heat was almost painful against my frozen skin. I took a sip. It was bitter and strong, the best thing I had ever tasted. After a few minutes, he spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, but gentle. "Looks like you're having a day worse than mine," he said. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask who I was or what I had done. He simply acknowledged my reality. In that moment, that small, simple act of being seen, of being acknowledged without judgment, was a crack in the fortress I had built around myself. A single, warm point of light in an ocean of cold, dark water. This stranger, with his umbrella and his coffee, had thrown me a lifeline I didn't even know existed. I held the warm cup between my hands, letting the heat seep back into my frozen bones. The simple, bitter taste of the coffee was more than just a drink. It was an anchor, pulling me back from the edge of a very dark abyss. I finally found my voice, though it was rough and cracked from disuse. "Thank you," I whispered, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. The old man just gave a slow, single nod. "The bus doesn't run on this line after 8, he said, his tone matter of fact, not unkind. "You'll be waiting here all night." I didn't know what to say to that. All night was what I had been prepared for. All forever. He sat with me in silence for a few more minutes, just listening to the rain patter on the umbrella. Then he stood up, his movements stiff but deliberate. "I live just around the corner," he said, not looking at me, but out at the glistening street. "It's warm, and I have a sofa." He finally turned his gaze back to me. "No sense in both of us catching our death out here." My entire body went rigid with a fresh wave of suspicion, warring violently with a desperate, aching need for shelter. This was how horror stories began. This was how fools ended up in ditches. But as I looked into his calm, weary eyes, I saw no malice, no hidden agenda. I saw the same deep tiredness I felt in my own soul, the kind that comes from carrying a heavy weight for a long, long time. Every instinct I had, honed in prison and on the streets, screamed at me to refuse, to run. But a quieter, older part of me, a part I thought had died years ago, recognized something in him. A flicker of basic, human decency. Slowly, feeling like I was moving in a dream, I stood up. My joints ached. I was taller than him, but I felt small and fragile. I just nodded, unable to form words. He turned and I followed, a few steps behind, like a lost dog. We didn't speak as we walked the 2 blocks to a small, well-kept house with a faint, warm light glowing in the front window. He opened the door, and a wave of dry, warm air washed over me, carrying the faint, comforting smells of old wood and soap. He stepped inside and held the door open for me. I hesitated on the threshold, the warmth from within feeling like a barrier as solid as the prison gate. Stepping over it felt like a monumental decision. I took a deep, shuddering breath and crossed into the light. The warmth of the house was a physical embrace. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling of the space. It was lived in, peaceful. The air smelled of lemon polish and old books. To my right was a small living room, and to my left, through an arched doorway, I could see a workshop. It wasn't a garage, but a proper workshop, built into a sunroom, with benches and tools hanging in neat rows. The sight of it, this place of creation, felt alien and deeply comforting all at once. "Leave your wet shoes by the door," the old man said, his voice calm as he hung his jacket on a peg. He moved to a wood stove in the corner of the living room and added a log, the flames dancing and casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. I stood there, awkward and dripping, following his instruction. My socks were wet, and I felt like I was contaminating the clean, woven rug. He came back with a towel and a pair of thick, woolen socks. "Here," he said. "The name's Arthur, by the way." "Liam," I managed to croak out, taking the towel. The simple act of exchanging names felt more intimate than anything I had experienced in years. He didn't bombard me with questions. He just let me dry off while he put a kettle on in the small adjoining kitchen. I looked around the living room. There were photographs on the mantelpiece. A woman with a kind smile. A younger Arthur with his arm around her. There were no recent pictures. The house had the quiet, settled feel of a place inhabited by a single, solitary soul. He came back with 2 mugs of tea and gestured for me to sit on the sofa. It was worn but clean. I sat on the edge, holding the mug, the heat a steady, reassuring presence in my hands. He didn't sit opposite me to interrogate me. Instead, he sat in a worn armchair at an angle, looking into the fire. "I was a carpenter," he said, as if continuing a conversation we'd already been having. "Worked with wood my whole life. People think it's a stubborn material. They're wrong. Wood has a memory. It has a story. Your job isn't to force your story onto it. Your job is to listen, to find the story it wants to tell, and then help it along." He took a sip of his tea. "A piece of wood, with a knot, a crack, a flaw. Most people see that as worthless. Throw it away. But that flaw, that's its history. That's what makes it strong. Sand it down, work with it, fill it with resin turned gold by the light. And that flaw becomes the most beautiful part. The part that makes it unique. The part that proves it survived." He wasn't looking at me, but every word felt like it was being carved directly into my soul. He was talking about wood, but he was describing a life. My life. The knots, the cracks, the deep, ugly flaws. He was describing a process of redemption I didn't think was possible. I sat there in the warm, quiet room, listening to the fire crackle and this stranger talk about golden scars. And for the first time since I walked out of that prison, I felt a tiny, fragile seed of something I barely recognized take root inside my hollow chest. It felt like hope. The next morning, Arthur didn't offer me empty platitudes or a plan for my life. He offered me work. "The shed out back needs organizing," he said over a simple breakfast of toast and eggs. "Tools are collecting dust. It's a mess. If you're looking for something to do, you can start there." It wasn't charity. It was a task, a purpose. And in that purpose, I found a lifeline. The shed was indeed a mess, but a beautiful one. It was a sanctuary of old, well cared for things. I spent the day sorting wrenches and chisels, brushing sawdust from planers, and arranging stacks of sandpaper by grit. The physical labor was familiar, a rhythm my body understood. But this was different from prison labor. This was for me. For this space. For Arthur. With every tool I cleaned, every shelf I straightened, I felt a small piece of my own chaos being put in order. Days turned into a week. I slept on the sofa. I ate meals with Arthur in his quiet kitchen. We spoke little, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was companionable. He began teaching me about the wood in his workshop. He showed me how to plane a rough board until it was smooth as silk, how to feel for the grain with my fingertips. "Let your hands see what your eyes can't," he'd say. My hands, which had known only violence and hard labor, were learning a new language, a language of creation. But the fear was always there, a cold snake coiled in my gut. It was the fear of the truth. Every time he trusted me with a new tool, every time he left me alone in the house, the fear grew. I was living a lie. He saw a man down on his luck. He didn't see the convict, the menace. The weight of my secret became heavier than any bag of tools. His kindness was a loan I knew I could never repay, and the interest was my own guilt. I was waiting for the moment it would all shatter. For him to find out, for the kindness to vanish from his eyes, replaced by the cold fear and disgust I knew so well. I was living on borrowed time, in a borrowed life, and the clock was ticking down to the moment I would lose it all. The moment of reckoning came on a Tuesday. The bell on the workshop door chimed, and a man walked in, someone from the neighborhood looking to have a chair leg repaired. Arthur was in the back, and I was at the workbench, carefully sanding a piece of cherry wood. I kept my head down, hoping to be invisible, but the man's eyes lingered on me. I felt his gaze like a physical touch, a cold spot on my skin. A few minutes later, I heard his voice, lowered but sharp enough to carry. "Arthur, you know who that is. You got working for you." I froze, the sandpaper gritty in my clenched fist. This was it, the end of the dream. Arthur's response was calm. "I do. That's Liam." "No, I mean, do you know who he is?" The man insisted, his voice dripping with urgency. "He's a convict. Did a long stretch. Armed robbery." The workshop fell silent, except for the hum of the overhead light. I couldn't breathe. I was waiting for the sound of Arthur's footsteps coming to ask me to leave. I was waiting for the shame to finally, fully consume me. But Arthur's voice, when it came, was the same steady, gravelly tone he always used. It held no surprise, no anger. "I know." The customer was flabbergasted. You, you know, and you let him in your house? Around your things?" I heard the soft scuff of Arthur's boots on the sawdust-covered floor as he walked over to my workbench. I couldn't look up. I stared at the wood in front of me, at the smooth, beautiful grain I had been revealing. I was waiting for the blow. But Arthur simply placed his hand on the piece of cherry wood I was working on. His fingers, old and calloused, traced the long, graceful line of the grain. "Yep," Arthur said, his voice clear and firm, meant for both me and the customer to hear. "I know everything I need to know. I see a man who shows up on time, a man who works with a careful hand, a man who respects the wood." He paused, and I finally dared to look up. He wasn't looking at the customer. He was looking directly at me, his eyes holding mine with an unwavering certainty. "I see the beauty he's bringing out of this wood right now. That's the only truth that matters in this shop." The customer muttered something and left, the bell chiming sharply behind him. The silence he left behind was different. It was clean. It was light. The coiled snake of fear in my gut unclenched and vanished. He knew. He had known, or he had figured it out. And it hadn't mattered. He didn't see the convict. He saw the man sanding the wood. In that moment, the last of the invisible walls I had built around myself, the walls made of other people's judgment and my own shame, crumbled into dust. I was not my worst mistake. I was the man on the sofa. I was the student in the workshop. I was Liam. For the first time in over a decade, I was just Liam. The weight that lifted from my shoulders in that moment was heavier than any prison gate. Arthur's simple, unshakable faith was the key that finally unlocked me from the inside. I wasn't a project to him. I wasn't a charity case or a risk to be managed. I was just a man he had found in the rain. We never spoke of that day again. We just continued our work in the quiet sanctuary of the workshop. I learned to turn cracked, discarded wood into pieces of beauty, filling the floors with gold, just as he had described. I was learning to do the same with the cracked and broken pieces of my own soul. I got a proper job at a small furniture shop, my skills speaking louder than my past. I rented a small apartment. I built a life, a simple, quiet, beautiful life. Arthur was my anchor, my friend, the grandfather I never had. For years, I thought I was the one who had been saved. And I was. But I realize now, I was also part of his redemption. The twist, the truth that still brings me to my knees, came years later when I was cleaning out his house after he passed peacefully in his sleep. I found a small, locked box in his closet. Inside, beneath a faded photograph of the woman from his mantelpiece, was a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local man killed in botched robbery, wife devastated." The date was 2 years before my own crime. The article said the thief was never caught. Arthur's wife, Eleanor, the woman with the kind smile, had died of a broken heart less than a year later. The man I tried to rob all those years ago His name was Ben, the boy in the convenience store. But the man whose life was truly destroyed by a single, desperate, violent act was Arthur. The stranger who found me in the rain wasn't just a kind man. He was a man who had every reason in the world to hate me, to see me as the monster who took everything from him. Instead, he saw a broken piece of wood, and he chose to fill my cracks with gold.